All right, welcome everybody to our panel event today. My name is Carson McPherson-Kretzky, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator and co-founder for the Hazard and Climate Resilience Institute. And I'm really excited to have you all here today for this exciting panel with a very lofty question: can economics help save the world? And we're going to get into that discussion shortly here. But before we do, I want to give a little background on what these monthly panel events that we're hosting with the Hazard and Climate Resilience Institute are, and also give a background on this Resource Nexus for Sustainability Grand Challenge that we are a part of, and this panel is also a part of as well. So just a few notes on logistics. We are going to have about 45 minutes of facilitated questions for the panelists, and then we'll open it up for about 15 minutes at the end for the audience and everyone here to ask questions. If you'd like to put questions in the chat as we're going, feel free to do that. And I will also make sure that I turn on live transcript. And so there should be that happening at the bottom if you need it. And any other questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. All right, so I wanted to just start by giving a brief overview of the goals of these panels. This is our second one that we're having this academic year, but the goals of these panels are really to connect across disciplines and sectors, to learn about ongoing projects and organizations, to find out how university researchers and students can better support local efforts and information needs, and to also consider what actions we can take moving forward. And this year, we've been working under this framework and this project related to the Grand Challenge Resource Nexus for Sustainability, which is trying to better understand how we here at Boise State can support projects that are focused on this topic of sustainability and be more sustainable in how we are doing that. And so you'll notice that the topics for these panels this year are focused on all these different aspects of sustainability, how we think about it, also how we think about how it relates to community resilience, which as an institute is what we're also focused on. So before we jump into introducing everyone, I want to give a couple definitions that I think are helpful for just framing this conversation. So the first is community resilience. So community resilience refers to the capacity of a community or region to adapt to change and thrive despite the chronic stresses such as access to resources, climate change, whatnot, and acute shocks like flooding and wildfire that they may experience. So there's this working definition that we have of resilience. So as we bring that up, keep that in mind. And then importantly, this year, we're really thinking about this idea of sustainability. And so here's just a picture of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it really encompasses all of these different areas from, poverty to life below water, climate action, energy, economics, all of these different things. And so hopefully some of our panels this year are going to be touching on this very broad and distributed way that we're thinking about sustainability. And I really liked this quote from the United Nations, which was that sustainability is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. So we're really excited to have our panelists here, but before we introduce them, I'm going to introduce Michael Fragius as our facilitator for the day, and he is a professor in the Department of Economics here at Boise State. So Michael, I will go ahead and turn it over to you to give us a little primer on what we're going to be talking about today, and then go ahead and introduce the panelists. I will stop sharing for that.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Carson, for this introduction. And I think it's going to be quite useful to have the concept of sustainability as a central concept for our discussion today, and in particular, how it relates to the field of economics. So I'm an economist also by training, and I've been working in this sort of space of the connections between economics and sustainability for as long as I can remember. I am confident that this is a great panel that you've put together today with accomplished economists, and not only economists. I believe they are all interdisciplinary scientists. And I think you will all get a very good view on how diverse economic thinking can be on the basis of what you're going to hear today. So I'm really, really excited to be listening also to what these panelists have to say. So we will be discussing how economics relates to the concept of sustainability. And we're going to do some stock taking. We're going to also be thinking about how economics is changing to adapt to this realization that we are experiencing a variety of rapid changes, global environmental change, a variety of socioeconomic changes that verge into crisis many, many times. I do want to point out that even economists have started to adapt their definition of sustainability, going beyond the one that you showed as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, to asking questions about whether we can continue to operate under existing patterns of activity. Can we do it safely, sensibly, and asking the questions of whether there are actually unacceptable consequences eventually for humanity. There is obviously this wider understanding of climate change and biodiversity loss and a whole host of other global changes that are also experienced locally, of course. So I think I would like to move to sort of the panelists and having them introduce themselves. After the introductions are done, I will start posing some questions. There's 4 pillars for our discussion today, but we will actually try to sort of loosely address those and have a more dynamic and lively discussion too. So I'm really happy to be joined by Lee, Tony, and Laura. So whoever wants to go first, please do.
I'll go first. My name is Lee Parton. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Economics here at Boise State University. My interests lie at the nexus of land use, non-market valuation, which I'll explain more and will come up throughout this discussion for sure, and also a deep interest in recreation and how land use kind of affects all of our well-being across a lot of different dimensions. And so that's where I hope to contribute to this discussion. And I will let the next person introduce themselves.
I can go, Tony, because I start with an L and you start with a T. But my name is Laura, and I live in Nampa, ancestral land of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe. I am a senior researcher at Earth Economics. We are an ecological economics nonprofit, and hopefully some of these ideas of ecological economics, Michael was pointing out how diverse the economics thinking can be, will percolate into the discussion. My favorite work that we do is working closely with community-based organizations and helping them develop an economics argument to accompany their efforts of sustainability, environmental justice, and overall achieving improvements in quality of life for their constituents. So that's, yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invite. Tony, you can go.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Tony Orlando. I carry the title of Analytics Engineer at the Freshwater Trust. My formal training is in Ag and Resource Economics. And I live in Boise. Our organization is focused on conserving and restoring freshwater ecosystems. I work daily on water resource related problems, attempting to impart economic theory and tools into our conservation and restoration planning and design. So we're a Portland-based organization, but I'm located in Boise.
Perfect. Thank you all. So Carson, if you don't mind, I will start with the first question for our panelists today. The first sort of theme, rather, it relates to stock taking. It relates to thinking about how economics has operated within this space of sustainability. So in light of what challenges we're observing currently, planetary challenges, what is the role that each of you as panelists think economics has to play in terms of working towards sustainability? And what do you think the major contributions of this particular discipline has been in promoting the current state of affairs? Whether it has offered solutions or whether it has sort of become in some ways part of problems. And I will let people jump on those questions as they see fit. Yeah.
I can start in this one. So I think and maybe everybody here will agree that economics is going to be critical when we're starting to think about ways to work towards sustainability, because, well, first of all, climate change and all these things are a result of economic actions, right? Like greenhouse gas emissions are because of how we produce things and the technologies that we have. So how we respond also through our economic choices is going to be important. But I think another really important point that I wanted to bring up is that whether we like it or not, a lot of these challenges that we're starting to face, or we have been facing for a while, are as much of a problem of economic inequality as anything else. And so if we're going to address some of these root causes, we're going to have to think about redistribution, not just of resources, but of responsibilities. And yeah, kind of shaping the trend or that neoliberal agenda that has been driving policy for a while. I think economic thinking and our role in shaping a political narrative is important.
Yeah, I largely agree, Laura. I see, I guess I see society facing more complex and more challenging trade-offs as we experience the realities of climate change, and I guess my kind of belief is that economic theory and tools should allow us to assess those and inform our decision making as a society and you know as individuals. And so I think the role of economics in this is you know is to play that informative an informative role in helping us assess decisions and uncertainty.
With context given to sustainability, I think economics is particularly adept at helping us understand two things. One is, in the classical definition of sustainability, is we don't want to make anybody worse off in the future based on our actions today. So that's kind of the definition of sustainability, but that leaves out what Laura was talking about issues of inequality and things like climate justice, where there have been some differential impacts that have been measured. So I think economics, one, plays a really important role in helping us understand what sustainability means as far as how do we reinvest in the future? What do we do today to provide better outcomes in the future? Where can our resources be spent and expended to improve the future, to solve some of these very, very difficult problems like climate change and the effects of that? The second thing I think economics can be really good at is, or really has the tools to help us understand, is the uncertainty associated with future outcomes. What is the uncertainty? What is the uncertainty of these different reallocations that we are considering? And I think that we have a really important role in trying to help not just understand and analyze that uncertainty, but also communicate it and communicate the implications of that uncertainty to a really wide and broad audience.
Would anyone like to sort of respond and follow any of the threads that have been mentioned? I've been picking up sort of things like economics as a tool for understanding, and sort of these questions about inequality and justice that may have not been fully addressed in the economics literature. Another dimension has to do with the way that economists have been thinking about capital, right? And sort of the wealth of nations. These are also sort of evolving ideas, and progressively they become more adequate for the world that we live in.
Michael, I think in your initial question, you asked about how economics contributed to the current state of things.
Mhm.
And to that, I'd like to note that I don't think anyone on this panel views economics as static in its understanding of the world or its applicability in improving outcomes. I think we need to look very closely at what economic impacts have been of past decisions and try to help broader audiences understand if we make these decisions again, let's have a clear stock and understanding of what the outcomes may be. And again, back to my earlier uncertainty idea, how uncertain are those outcomes?
Yeah, I think something that's tricky about what we do is that so much of what we study and the implications of our research are used for policy and sometimes for politics, right? And so how things get weaponized. I don't think you can really separate economics from political science, right? Originally, we were the political economy, the political management of the economy. So I think to the extent that we're tied to that public discourse, it gives us also more responsibility on how we approach things and how we maybe need to be a little bit more careful. I do think that as a discipline, we have quite a variety of tools, and we can think holistically. We have all these metrics and like things like the social cost of carbon, ideas of like the Human Development Index, all these ideas that really show that we can think holistically and in an integrated way. I think how we start drawing lines, and maybe that's not the right way to do it, but we do have to be conscious that whatever we do is going to have an implication for the policy discussion as well. So that's somewhere where I think we can improve as a discipline, trying perhaps to be more active or at least more conscious of that role that we have.
Great. I think this is giving me an opportunity to transition to the next theme that we will be discussing, which relates to how the discipline can change and improve in the future. I'm also looking at the chat. There are some questions also that relate to this theme. So one question that has been already posed has to do with capitalism as a system for organizing sort of economic activity being potentially the root of the problem. And I would say, well, does the discipline of economics and economic theory have any relation to that, or how actually do you think it's related, and potentially how can that also affect future trajectories? So the question that is posed to the panelists is, do you think economics has to change to promote this transition to sustainability that is sort of currently being discussed as very, very important for the prosperity of our species? Does it have to be radical? That goes to the question of sort of capitalism as sort of the economic system here, or can it be incremental? So what are the views of the panelists on that? And is there any evidence that you consider as important in terms of whether this change is actually happening within economics?
I guess I might offer, I mean, I think one piece that that I see sort of hindering economics is the communication piece that Lee mentioned, and I think that there's a lot of room for growth in effectively communicating some of the ideas and some of the tools and some of the analyses that we all perform or are involved in, across disciplines and across various pieces of our society. And I think that sometimes there is a kind of a bubble of economists and people who like talking to each other and kind of track what one another is saying. But there's I think there's a lot of opportunity to communicate some of what we do in a more clear way and leverage the tools that we have to address some of the more complex issues that we're facing.
Tony, can I ask a follow-up? What do you think is the challenge of sort of communicating? Why wouldn't economists be able to communicate as well, perhaps? Yeah, does it have to do with sort of the language that has been adopted for, let's say, mainstream economics, which is in a very significant sense mathematics? Are there other challenges in terms of concepts?
I think there's some of those things. I honestly, I guess from my experience, I think people like black and white answers, and I think oftentimes economics kind of gives us the results of what we do kind of gives us a less prescriptive and more holistic. At least we aim to have a more holistic result, and so if we, it depends is a common phrase that we have to utter, and so it's just getting to the point where people can accept kind of what that uncertainty that Lee's talking about is, and recognizing that like there are all these trade-offs associated with whatever decisions we end up making, I think is the challenge.
Perfect, thank you.
I wanted to go back to the radical change that we need. I think one of the, and I don't know if this is how we're not communicating well very often, but it's something that we're, I think, failing to do as economists is questioning some of those driving assumptions behind the work that we do. And just at the very beginning, how we approach things. I think often we don't really question things like competition is the only force of nature, or the ultimate goal is growth. We saw it in the first, one of the first slides that Carson shared with all the 17 social development goals. And one of them, I think it was number 8, I noticed decent work and economic growth. And so to show that we have a hard time disconnecting from the idea that we need economic growth forever for anything that we do as a society. And even if we try to be sustainable, we must have growth. So I think we kind of failed to question that assumption. In nature, the only thing that grows forever is get cancer. So that's maybe a sign that we do have to question things that perhaps are at the foundation of capitalism, as it's exposed in one of the questions. However, I think that even if we change it changes radically, and I think there are like signs showing that we are changing. It's not enough. It's not enough that we change radically, because, as I've been saying, everything comes hand in hand with the political economy. So we have to think about what is politically feasible as well, right? So maybe we do want this radical change. Maybe it's gonna have to be incremental because of just how politics are, and that just another thing to complicate things is that not only we need political support for these changes, we need good governance. So we could have the political support, but we don't have competent people driving. We're going to also have to require that is met. So it's a lot more complicated than just changing the paradigm and changing these huge structures to make it practical. So we do need radical change now, not just from the discipline, for things to actually turn into meaningful change for society, I think.
I'd like to push back just a little bit on the dichotomy between radical and incremental. And I think it lumps different concepts into kind of these two specific dichotomous or two categories that is not necessarily the case. To Laura's point, maybe it's not radical change that's needed, but radical change in recognition of reality, not just amongst populations, but amongst economists. Thinking about what it means to have the best outcome versus the realistic outcome, changing thought processes about what is the right measure. Inherently, that's what the question is regarding growth. Is it the right measure? Are we measuring the right things? And this runs across economics and analysis tools as kind of an underlying thread. How do we think about those things? I think back to, a couple of questions in the chat about capitalism, and I saw one interesting comment about more is always better, which I think sometimes gets associated with capitalism. In my outlook in the context of economics is that individuals and entities and governments respond to incentives. And we have to take a step back and ask, what is the incentive structure? Yeah, it might be baked into economic theory in some level that, more is, as we like to say, goods are good. More of stuff is better than less of stuff. But that doesn't mean that more of something is the right allocation of that resource when we talk about benefits to society. And I think, again, the radical versus incremental policy approaches might be right, and radical realignment of how we think about economics and resources might be more beneficial than radical economic change per se.
And I think I want to add something here. Sorry, Michael. Just a note here on the idea that more is always better in economic theory. It depends on what economic theory you're saying. As Michael said earlier, there is quite a diversity in economic thinking, and so what we're exposed to is neoclassical theory, but there's plenty other schools of thought that offer different views, and they have different objectives as well. So I think just because of maybe how we teach things, we're generally just exposed to one way of thinking, when the reality is we have a lot of ideas. We know this about resiliency, right? Like it's nice to have diversity. So maybe that's something that's worth bringing back into the university, and maybe that would help us communicate better as well, just understanding that there are very many different ways of doing economic thinking as well.
And do you see evidence for any sort of tendency for economists to, let's say, going back to Lee's comment, changing sort of the yardstick through which they're measuring prosperity or progress? Do you think we're kind of stuck in existing sort of indicators like the gross domestic product? What do you feel? Is there any change? Are you sensing any change?
I sense change. I guess I'm a little bit broken here, but I sense change, but mostly because of the people I follow on Twitter. So I think I'm biased, right? If I guess I don't really study how, as a discipline, we're moving. I think a lot of the political crisis, the social crisis, are bringing up into the surface all these issues that I just wonder, is this capitalism, is this neoclassical way of thinking the right approach. And I see a lot of people asking questions, at least the group of people that I follow. I see that in Latin America, there's big rise in different thoughts and a big push for changes in curriculums. I think for what I hear, pretty similar in Europe, and we all have a different monster we're trying to fight, right? Some people are fighting colonialism, some people are fighting oligarchs, some people are fighting corporations. And so to the extent that we're starting to look at these big powers, and that's, I don't know, motivating deeper questions and how they are related to the distribution of economic power and means of production. I think I see the change, but again, it's mostly probably because I'm so biased.
Right. And I think the individual sort of perspectives definitely have a role to play. Lee, did you have a comment on this one, Tony?
I mean, I guess I would just offer that I think in the policy conversations, I mean, I think things like economic equality and sustainability are probably far more commonplace today than they were 20 years ago. So, I mean, I think the change is, we're realizing it in real time, and it's they're not as unconventional thoughts as they may have been, 40 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, so I on this note, I will move on to the next theme, which gets to sort of your individual perspective as researchers, as you are exploring this literature of the connection between economics and sustainability. What concepts do you find more promising? What are worthwhile avenues to pursue in terms of doing research within economics, but also having sort of maintaining that interdisciplinary perspective, thinking about the systems, coupled human natural systems, and so on. There are a variety of concepts that have already, some of them have already been mentioned in this discussion too. So growth, the question of growth versus degrowth, other concepts like circular economy that involves eliminating waste, pollution, circulating products and materials, and regenerating nature. The economics of climate change, the big question about valuing ecosystem services and placing dollar figures on those. As individuals who are engaged in research and thinking about this space, which of these topics do you find more sort of more interesting? Are there other topics that you would find as being more central for connecting economics and sustainability? What is your sort of personal sort of take on this?
I think my personal take or personal connection to kind of this question probably is mostly on the green infrastructure side. And so a lot of what our organization does is providing tools and trying to apply analytics in a way that we can compare some of the traditional gray infrastructure solutions for things like compliance to maybe more innovative green infrastructure solutions. And so we do a lot of riparian restoration. We do a lot of in-stream habitat renewal. And I think that there are these whole economies that are associated with those actions in terms of being able to be leveraged for recreational uses, providing jobs and opportunity for the long-term maintenance of those projects. And so I think there's a way to leverage the environment in a way that we have historically leaned on engineered solutions, so that we could actually have a positive impact and provide some more sustainable outcomes.
from my perspective, I do a lot of work in the realm of trying to understand what resources in the environment are worth. And I think that this is one of the ways in which economics has really excelled in the past 20 years. We've developed deep understandings of trying to value the effects of land use change, of loss of riparian habitat, of wildfire, of clean water, of clean air. I saw a comment in the chat about, more is better, doesn't seem to work in the context of the commons and the public trust. And this is, in my opinion, a reflection of some of the incentives surrounding those things, where we don't have the incentive to conserve on the individual level. And that's where I see my role as really contributing to the betterment of society and increasing sustainability moving forward, is to help us understand, what does it mean when we lose open space? What is the cost of that? Because there can be implications for years to come. And with the, again, I tread a lot in gray areas. I don't think growth or degrowth is the right way to think about sustainability and economics in our economic system. I don't think that sustainability means no growth, and I don't think that growth means no sustainability. I think that it's a matter of what our target is, what's important to us, what is valued in society, what are the effects of our actions, and we can still have growth and sustainability and redistribution and environmental justice and these other types of questions that are really complicated to ask and think about. So that's, you asked for a personal point of view. That's mine, is that it's not A or B. You can target B and get A as well. That's all.
Yeah, so I think there's really a lot here to disclose, but I think so. What I think is, we have reached a point where we need to play the game, right? We're gonna need to update capitalism. I don't know that we're gonna fix it completely. I think degrowth is a path that offers a lot of really insightful suggestions and tools. At some point, I think it is pretty consistent with the idea of bringing the commons back into light as these places where we can share the management of resources in a sustainable way, for example. So I think the degrowth ideas are pretty consistent with how we think about commons and really how all the ways that they can contribute to the sustainability. I think degrowth is pretty noble. Is it scalable? I'm not totally sure. I think, as I've been saying, for it to be implemented kind of like worldwide, a lot needs to change beforehand. It doesn't mean we shouldn't aim for those goals that are proposed there. I think, yeah, we're always kind of walking on the slack line. Is the alternative? The alternative is not necessarily greener on the other side. It's tricky. I would also take something here on the valuation of ecosystem services. I do that a lot as part of my job. I have this internal tension all the time that I'm one step away from turning the earth into just another commodity, right? So it is very important for us to visualize what are the trade-offs, but then we do need to be careful on when is this maybe borderline undesirable, maybe even immoral. So I think all these are pretty difficult questions. Can we have growth? Can we have it all? I think this is like related to that idea of green growth. I don't think so, because what happens when we have full clean energies going on? I don't think we're going to stop, cutting the trees or getting other things that we have from nature. I don't know that if we don't change the driving paradigm, we're going to achieve sustainability. And I think it starts with recognizing that maybe growth, the way we're defining it, is not really what we need. Perhaps if we focus more on distribution of wealth, maybe we can still improve the lives of most people. Maybe not the billionaires, but maybe most of the people on the planet can still improve their lives. So I said a lot of things there. I'm happy to elaborate on any of them.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's going to be a good opportunity to elaborate. Actually, we do have a question directly on this one. What are sort of some of the principles of degrowth, and do you think also that degrowth would be synonymous with steady state economics? And what would be the difference if not? Anyone would be willing to say some things on this one?
I'll weigh in briefly. I wouldn't say that it is synonymous with steady state economics, because I think that might mean something different to economists than what we would think about as a steady state. If you talk to your neoclassical economist, that's a new Keynesian macroeconomist in the parlance of talking about how we think about macroeconomic growth, when they think of steady state, it would be some sort of steady GDP growth into infinity, which is growing to infinity possible or smart or the right way to go. So I wouldn't say that that's synonymous with steady state economics. And then degrowth, to me, means, when I hear that discussion, it's about shrinking economies. But I don't personally like the term in that context. Again, I think it's more of what Laura's getting at is, can we improve the well-being of individuals en masse without exploiting and destroying resources that are very valuable to society as a whole? And so I tend not to use the term degrowth per se as far as shrinking economies, because economies can be measured lots of different ways, as Laura discussed earlier, with Human Development Index and things like that. So again, maybe it's a radical realignment of how we think and view growth versus the traditional measures. And again, that's maybe not a common opinion, but mine.
Perfect. Yeah. Go ahead. Last comment for this question.
Yeah, sorry. I think you're right in that the term is problematic. If anything, it's just a terrible marketing strategy to call anything degrowth. For how I understand it is the proposal is we can choose which sectors of the economy we're going to focus on growing, right? So maybe there are things that we really don't need to spend on, or we don't want these things to grow. So maybe we're going to limit, I don't know, anything that is built obsolescence, by design of the government to grow just for the sake of growing, or just profit for the sake of profit. Those things we can limit and focus on things that we believe will bring more value, more welfare for more people. So it's not just not growing, but focusing on what parts of the economy we can grow, and also understanding that some people still need to grow in the world to achieve, at least minimum living standards. So I think the growth does try to get at that global justice. But yeah, I do think that the term is problematic just it sounds bad.
Michael, you're muted.
Another question that was posed that relates directly to this question has to do with this concept of the donut economics approach, which essentially takes limits very seriously, not sort of pushing limits on the natural systems, and not sort of falling below some other foundational limits on the socioeconomic space. Which again, I think we should also discuss in the Q&A section. So we do have one other theme that maybe each of you should take a few seconds to discuss before we get to the Q&A. What is the relevance of this discussion for the local level? If you think about the Boise metropolitan area, if you think about the state of Idaho in our region, how can we use some of these ideas to affect the prosperity of people and natural systems locally?
I guess I'll take a stab at this. I think locally in Idaho, particularly in the Treasure Valley, but across the whole state, we have an abundance of natural resources. And I think that they provide a ton of value to our, to both the economy and the community that is local, and those that come to visit and leverage those resources. I think engaging with the major resource users in our area to look for ways to preserve or restore those resources, I think is the water quality problems that we face in the Snake are, it's hard to detach those from a lot of the industry in our area. And so, I think the most effective way is through outreach and through engagement with the users of those resources, and trying to come up with innovative solutions that leverage, that leverage the choices that those individual users have to make, and make those choices more sustainable, through innovative solutions, I guess.
I think there's another area of work, and I haven't really been part of it directly, but I have heard that in Idaho there's pretty good work done in working with the tribal nations. And I think there's so much that we can learn from working with tribes. They know so much about being good stewards of nature and living sustainably with nature. So that I see as an opportunity. And I just will come back to saying the same thing. If we're gonna update how we're driving this earth, we're gonna need to rethink not just relating with the environment, but with each other. I think all these ideas that are more ancestral and perhaps more in tune with nature can help us make better decisions. This idea of planning 7 generations ahead, right? Like that alone can help us so much. And so that's another area where I see potential.
I think from my perspective on this question about taking it to the local level, and is really what Tony said, it's engaging with the policymakers, being a resource for policymakers, and furthermore, on top of that, putting significant thought into what are, for lack of a better term, good bang for the buck policies? Like, where can we make significant differences? And I hate to cast it as a marketing problem without causing any sort of significant pain or perceived loss in the local economies. And that really comes back to helping individuals and policymakers understand what choices have effects on what sectors of the economy, what sectors of the environment, how we choose to place industry, what industries we choose to promote, what effects those will have, not just on the economy, but on the environment, and why it's important, why that environment is important, why those natural resources are so important.
Perfect. I think we have about 10 minutes left for the Q&A. We have already several questions on the chat. Some of them we kind of integrated in the discussion organically. Some of them we have not addressed, and I would urge people to put more questions in the chat at this point if you have them. Yeah, I mean, I think as panelists, you also can see the chat questions. If you would like to jump on any of them, feel free to do that. I'll just point out one of the early ones by Carlos. He says, I'm studying ecology, perceiving a disconnect between what ecology and economics might prioritize to reach sustainability. What would you recommend to a young ecologist so that they can work in collaboration with economists? Which is a great question for folks who are doing interdisciplinary work.
I work with a team of ecologists and conservation scientists across a few different domains. And I think understanding the theory from each discipline and putting forth the effort to one of the most valuable things is trying to understand how ecologists view problems, how biologists view problems, how land use scientists view problems, and how economists view problems. I don't think that once we're in the same room having the same discussion that ecologists and economists would prioritize different strategies or resources to achieve sustainability. And back to just thinking about sustainability in general. As an economist, when somebody asks me about sustainability, and when I have conversation with ecologists, my first thought is, I always want to answer the question, sustain what and sustain it for whom? And I think that that's something we have to keep in mind with sustainability because it means something different to everyone. So just start from that question, what are we trying to sustain and for whom? And then we can use our tools to get on the same page and try to understand how to move forward.
Yeah, I think kind of building on what Leah is just saying is, in my day-to-day, I work also closely with a ton of ecologists, and a lot of the problems that a lot of the problems I'm trying to solve are, all of these actions, all these decisions that we can make that are related to the environment have some ecological response. And how do we, for me, it's often from the cost perspective, but how do we, if we're going to spend $1 million, what is the ecological response that we expect to come from that? And it gets kind of back to building on that. That allows us to help prioritize what the biggest bang for the buck projects are that that we can invest in and realize some, sustainable outcome by tackling a certain project.
I think I don't know so much of a disconnect between the goals or how we prioritize things. I think one of our limitations is that what counts is what is being counted, right? And so much of this we can't measure so easily in economic terms. And we have done a lot of progress in that area, and we have pretty neat tools for it. But so working together to make sure we're counting, and not just in one metric, that we have different dashboard, right, of metrics to show impacts of things will help us work closely. I don't think there's so much of a disconnect in goals, but what tools do we have to count things and to make, yeah, to turn things into meaningful number for this to understand. Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in just for these last 5 minutes here and go ahead and pull out another one of the questions that we had from the audience. So we have only 5 minutes, so panelists, please be brief in your responses. So this was from Greg Servine, and it kind of goes off what Laura was just saying, is how do we value these different things and how do we count them? The question was, how can economics ensure we have and sustain biodiversity, or is it problematic because it's limited to mostly a utilitarian view and measures? So maybe Laura, do you want to start that one, and then we can see what other folks have to say?
Well, that's tricky, right? Because do we give incentives for people to sustain biodiversity? Do we have markets for biodiversity? Maybe not just that, right? Like, I don't think there's like a silver bullet, right? We know these things. Maybe that's part of it, having the incentives, but I don't know, maybe regulation as well goes hand in hand. I think it's a very difficult question. I think we do have tools that work in some contexts. Biodiversity is so local, right? It depends what place you're studying and what species you're looking at and how it relates to the rest of the landscape. So I think not one size fits all was going to work there.
I think I might just offer this kind of highlights the importance of the interdisciplinary nature of a lot of our work, and understanding. I think, you know, maybe what the economist's role in some of this is understanding helping to understand what those trade-offs are. That, you know, if we lose biodiversity, what happens? And you know, to Lee's earlier point about uncertainty, it's kind of, you know, I think that's where we can help answer those questions, but it requires sort of this interdisciplinary approach to actually solving the problem.
I agree, Tony. We can't, back to Carlos's question, we can't without the ecologists and the biologists. We can't ensure that, but we can, like Tony said, help quantify and measure and estimate the uncertainty of the effects of that biodiversity loss. Maybe it's really small, maybe it's really big, and it's deceiving on where that falls. So we need to bring our tools to the table to help understand what the potential effects are so people can make informed decisions. If we don't help put a number on it and think about the distribution of the costs of those things, then in my opinion, it defaults to zero and it goes away.
Perfect. Thank you for those responses. All right, we have 2 minutes left, so maybe now we could just all go around. I don't think we're going to be able to get to any more questions, but we could go around if you guys have any last things you'd like to share that maybe you didn't get to say quite yet and you want to share. And Michael, feel free to add to it as well. So thank you. And why don't we start with Tony? And you're muted. There you go.
I think I would offer, when the original flyer for this came out, it said, "Can economics save the world?" And I was quite relieved to see that it was changed to, "Can economics help save the world?"
Short and sweet. That was perfect. Lee?
To follow on to Tony, I think economics can help save the world. We need to look around and ask what the incentives are that we see for markets, environmental markets and biodiversity markets around us, and make sure we are considering those things as we try to shape policy.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think because of the very nature of the thing that we study, right, human beings, and human beings have and culture, it makes what we do really difficult. So we have had to become pretty clever at working interdisciplinarily and use, our systems hats and tools from various fields, statistics, computer science, psychology, all these things. So I think we have been able to improve our toolbox to help measure those human responses to changing conditions. And I think we have tools to help. Yeah, we need to do it.
Michael?
My closing thought is yes. The answer is yes. Definitely, economics. It has to come from a multiplicity of disciplines and through collaboration, coordination. Economics has been viewed imperialistic in the past, sort of stealing sort of good ideas and putting it into the econ framework. This is not the way necessarily to go about this. I mean, I think we need sort of better collaborations and sort of better understanding of what's happening. I'll plug for our college here. Business is also quite important. So when we think about economics, we need to be thinking about sort of the broader structure and convincing a lot of folks in that space that this is a core aspect of what they should be doing, so that some change happens from there, but obviously not just there, from a multiplicity of areas. But I will leave it at that. We're 1 minute beyond our planned time.
I know, try to stick to it, but this was such a great conversation. So I just want to say thank you to all the panelists for coming today. It was just a really rich and interesting discussion, and I had so much fun listening. And thank you, Michael, for being a wonderful facilitator for this event. I'm so appreciative of all of your time. And I just briefly want to say that next month's event is actually a really great continuation of this. We're going to be having U of I, some folks who participated in a climate economic impact assessment for the state of Idaho, talking about that assessment. So it's kind of an interesting continuation of this conversation next month. So stay tuned to hear when that will be, and we hope to see you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Carson. Thank you, Michael. Bye.